We had this evening, we basically had 7 episodes. So this is a little recap in our 7 episodes. First, the call to go. Number 2, pieces, right? So far in Genesis, we have studied the first 11 chapters. From the creation stories to the recreation after the flood, the recreation with Noah and his family, and God's second pronouncement to go and be fruitful and multiply. Genesis started as a human story. It was a story of humanity, the creation of humanity, the development of humanity. But now that we get into chapter 12, the story is becoming more specific. It was a more general story, now it's more specific. It's still very much connected to the previous chapters, of course, but it now becomes a family story. This is a story of a smaller family focusing on the children of Abraham, the children of Isaac, the children of Jacob. The rest of Genesis will take us from Father Abraham, which is where we are today, to slavery in Egypt. And it's going to set up the book of Exodus and sets up also the rest of the entire Torah. So that's where we are. This is where we're heading towards. And it starts with this interesting, let's call it, if for those of you who like romantic comedies, probably some of you do, a little meet cute. Is that what it's called? I think that's what it's called. I've heard that before. We're going to call it that tonight. The beginning of chapter 12 is the meeting. This is how the story starts. And the entire story that we read tonight, all of the Abraham story, the key is just those first few verses in chapter 12. The other verses and chapters are still important, so if you read it, you shouldn't regret it. But the key is in the first few verses of chapter 12. Abraham leaves everything familiar behind. That's the key to this story. He leaves behind his land. He leaves behind his family. He leaves behind his culture, his community, even his gods and the gods of his people, to follow the voice of a God he does not yet know. Those first verses of chapter 12 are Abram at the time, meeting Yahweh. Abraham's land was a land of moon worshippers. Where he's from, where he starts, historically was a land of moon worshippers. So presumably, he worshipped the local gods, just like the rest of his people. And the amazing piece of this story is that he takes this unprecedented chance on a new God, Yahweh. And it becomes even more amazing because Yahweh says to Abram, "Leave your land and leave your family." Not his wife, but his father's house, and go with no destination. God doesn't give him the coordinates. God doesn't tell him, here's how it's all going to go. It's all going to be fine. So just leave. If you leave now, you'll be okay. We're going to settle in this land in 2 weeks. There's none of that. God says, leave it and go. And Abram does, with only a promise from a God he just met. It's pretty astounding. It sets the course for Abram's life, clearly, and we see that in Genesis, right? It sets the course for the life of his children, all the way through Genesis, all the way through the Torah, all the way through the Old Testament, all the way through the New Testament. This decision that Abram makes in chapter 12 still affects our lives today. As Christians who trace our history back to Abram as well, right? This is a life-changing decision for Abram. It's a life-changing decision for the entire world. And it's interesting to think about, what would happen if Abram would have said no? How much would the world have changed? But he didn't, so he goes on. And he goes on with a promise. And promises are very important in the book of Genesis. So the patriarchs are all, will make promises to through the patriarchs throughout the book of Genesis. Abram, on his journey with God, is basically promised four things. Okay? He's promised a son, he's promised a land, he's promised a nation, and he's promised a blessing. Let's talk about that a little bit. So the son one is first, but that is impossible. So it's kind of a shaky start, right? So God promises Abram a son, and it's not a possibility. The son is not a possibility. But Abram still believes it. So the problem is Abram's too old. And more importantly, his wife was too old. He leaves his homeland. The text tells us he's 75 years old. Okay? And we know that Sarah also is too old. The text tells us she's 10 years younger. We get this later. She's 90 years old by the time of the second covenant when God's still making the promise. 90 years old. Which is why it's a little hard to believe, right? But that's part of the promise, the son. And not only is she too old, you might remember in the end of chapter 11 when we were looking through the genealogies leading up to the birth of Abram, Genesis tells us, the author of Genesis tells us, that not only is Sarah too old, she cannot have children. That's part of the story too. So not only is the age working against her, she's also barren. And yet this is the first promise. This is the promise that Abraham believes. That she is barren and unable to have children is going to be a theme throughout the entire book of Genesis. It's going to be a theme throughout the Old Testament. We even see it in Luke's gospel. Right? Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, same kind of situation. She can't have children, but she's having a child. This is going to be a theme throughout the Bible. And it's possible, as we've been reading through Genesis, it's possible that Sarah's story in some way traces back to the disobedience of Adam and Eve. You might remember after their disobedience in the garden, Eve ate of the fruit. Part of the curse was that there would be pain, anxiety, and difficulty in childbirth and in childbearing. So there could be the connection there, and then Sarah lives into their disobedience by being unable to have children. It also shows that God is actively involved in the plan of salvation. Right? The plan of salvation does not rely on humans alone. We've already read the first 11 chapters. We know if that was the plan, that plan would probably fail. And we remember this from the Noah story when God makes a decision in God's heart to say, if these people are going to survive, I got to stick with them, or else they're going to mess this thing up. I know that. And so once again, we see this is an impossible situation. It's impossible for Abram to have a son, but God makes that promise anyway because God does not leave humanity alone to carry out the plan of salvation. God is actively involved. And God continues to be involved in the human story. It's part of this promise. But even so, the birth of the son is still complicated. Any child is impossible, and yet in the story, Abram gets two sons, which further complicates the promise. And what we're going to see again, which was first displayed in the Cain and Abel story, is we again see that there is a divine preference for the younger son. And this will continue to be a theme in Genesis as well. Started with Cain and Abel. We see it in the story of Abram. Because he can't have any sons, but he has two. And God's divine preference is for his younger son. So we start with Ishmael. Abram's first son. Right? In the story, Abram's first son is Ishmael, not Isaac. So the concept is very foreign to us, I think, for the most part. But Sarai giving over Hagar to birth her husband's child was not unusual in the ancient biblical world. It would be surprising today, not so surprising then. And the biblical audience would not have seen that as being a shocking thing. So folks were willing to go to the backup plan in the ancient biblical world because not having a child in that culture was considered embarrassing at best, And at worst, it was, to some, a sign of a shameful divine curse. So some people in the culture would look at that and say, oh, God is not allowing them to have children. This is a divine curse. So people would go to great lengths to have children, and this was Sarah's idea. But because Sarah is the primary wife, Abram's primary wife, Ishmael would be raised as her child, even though she did not give birth to him. So this was not terribly uncommon. And I think why that's important for us to realize is that it means that we need to be careful not to make Ishmael into a throwaway character. I think it's easy to do because we see later that the covenant is carried out through Isaac and through Isaac's sons and through Isaac's children. But we need to remember that Ishmael is Abram's legitimate eldest son. And one way we can tell this is that, like throughout the book, his place of privilege is subverted. Right? So this is one of the ways we can tell that, because we're going to see that. We've seen it already. We're going to continue to see it through the stories. The oldest son, his position of privilege being subverted. Abraham even pleads with God to accept Ishmael and make him the child of the covenant. Did you notice that in the book? Where God's saying, no, you're going to have another son with Sarah. And he's like, well, I wish you'd just accept Ishmael. Why won't you just accept him? But God doesn't. That said, God does promise to bless Ishmael. And, again, we want to make sure we catch this. Ishmael is circumcised into the covenant community. He's not left on the outside. God promises a blessing to Ishmael and his children, and he is circumcised into the community. But the covenant promises live on through Isaac's descendants of the younger son. So Abram's promised a son, he's also promised land. Abram starts with land, by the way. So God makes a promise for land. We see right at the beginning of chapter 12, Abram has land. He has a homeland. That's important to remember. It's not like he's at rock bottom and God's like, I'll give you something. And he's like, I should take that. He has stability. He has his father's house. He has land. And still he goes. He leaves home and he leaves his land. And he becomes a sojourner. He lives as a resident alien in foreign lands. That is Abram's story. He lives as a resident alien in foreign lands. And he dies chasing this promise of land. It's not realized in his lifetime. Now he sees land. God shows him land. God tells him about the land, but he never takes possession of it. It's his descendants who take possession of the land with, we might add, varying degrees of success throughout the Old Testament. God also promises Abram a nation. Now we have perspective. So we can look back and we can see what that might look like. Abram couldn't see that necessarily, but we can see it. So we look back and we see the three largest monotheistic religions in the world find their roots in the Abraham story. Right? So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all trace their roots back to Father Abraham. And this is the promise, that Abram will be a patriarch of a people. And Sarah, which means princess, her name means princess, God promises that nations and kings will come from her. So that's the promise in Genesis. What we can do is we can look back and we can see ways in which we might consider that promise fulfilled. So we can see it in a few ways. We can look at the world religions and we can say, wow, that is peoples that trace their roots back to Abram. That's a fulfillment of that promise. We can also look at it if we look at something like the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. In the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, it traces King David through Abram. And King David was the king of the golden age of Israel in the Old Testament. And so we could say kings did come from Sarah through Isaac's line. That's the fulfillment of the promise. We can also look, because that genealogy goes on, and from our perspective as Christians, we can look and we can see in Matthew's gospel that Jesus comes through that line from Abram as well. And so we could see, once again, a king from that perspective, Christ the King, coming through Abram's line. There are a number of ways to look at that promise and see its fulfillment on this side. Of course, Abram did not have the perspective to see, King David, the greatest king of Israel, would be from my child Isaac. He doesn't have that perspective. We have that perspective. And finally, a blessing. Now, there are some blessings built in from the creation story of life and fertility. And so those blessings, of course, we see that those become blessings that are realized in Abram's life, right? Life and fertility. Those are blessings, the blessings set up in creation. So those are included in this. But there are also ways in which others outside of the covenant community are blessed by Abraham and his seed, and his descendants. It's another way to look at the blessing, the promise of the blessing. So in chapter 12, verse 3, God says to Abram, I will bless those who bless you. And those who curse you, I will curse. And all the families of the earth will be blessed because of you. We see hints of this fulfillment already in the book of Genesis. If you look at the end of Genesis, you see how the children of Abraham bless the world around them, even folks outside of the covenant community, outside of the nation. So we see that Joseph ends up in Egypt. The people of Egypt are blessed because of Joseph and his work. So that would be, I will bless those who bless you. Joseph's elevated. The whole nation is preserved through famine. However, they become enslaved. And then we see all of the plagues and the nation cursed. And I will curse those who curse you. And I think that extends not just to Abraham, but as it will with all the patriarchs, but also his children. And so we start to see throughout Scriptures, we see the promises made in the Abram story, in the Abraham story, are fulfilled throughout the Scriptures. That the authors are very aware of this. And we can see that fulfillment as we read through the Bible. One of the things you might have noticed in the Abraham story, in the chapters that we read, is that God enters into covenant with Abram. 2 times. Did you notice there are 2 covenant stories? So we've seen this in Genesis so far, right? 2 covenant stories. Did anybody notice that? So we have chapter 15, covenant story. Chapter 17, another covenant story of God with Abram. Now, a lot of scholars will suggest that chapter 15, that first covenant story, is the Yahwist's version. So we've been talking about the different sources of the tradition. The J source, the Yahwist tradition. And then chapter 17 is the priestly version of the covenant story. The first covenant story is interesting, I think. It's sort of shrouded in this mysterious darkness. The foci of the promise that God makes are descendants and land. There are 2 things promised in the first covenant, descendants and land. And the ritual used is especially interesting. And it may be even especially more interesting on Blessing of the Animals night, but it's splitting a bunch of animals in half. So that's part of the covenant in chapter 15. Now, this was not unheard of in ancient cultures. In fact, it was sometimes the practice that 2 parties entering into a covenant agreement would bind themselves together through this type of ritual. And the understanding was that if one of the parties violated the covenant, if they broke the covenant, they would share the fate of the cleft animals. Right? So that was the promise. If I mess this up, may the same be done to me. It's a pretty intense way of making an agreement. I think we could all agree with that. But there is an unusual part of this covenant. It's unusual here that only God goes between the animals. So in the ancient world, if this covenant were made between two people, both of them would go through the animals together. They would both be entering into this covenant together. They would be sharing equal partners. In the story in chapter 15, only God, in the form of the smoking pot, goes through between the animals. Abram is in the story. He chases birds away, and he sleeps. But what the story is telling us is that God is solely responsible for the covenant. And not only is God solely responsible for the covenant, God makes the promise in blood. God's very serious about this. And God is saying, I will be the one who upholds this covenant we have together. In the second story, chapter 17, this priestly story, we see some of the same elements. Descendants and land are promised again. But like the priestly version of the Noah covenant, there are parallels between those two. So we saw the priestly covenant in the Noah story. We're seeing the priestly version of the covenant in the Abraham story as well. And the parallels are, it is set up by God, it is an enduring covenant, and the covenant comes with a sign of the covenant. In this case, circumcision. Although it's important that we notice that there is a difference here, and the difference in the sign of the covenant is that the bow in the Noah story was a sign for God, that God set up that sign to help God remember not to do this again. The circumcision is a reminder for the people. It's also worth noting that it's only done to men. No female circumcision in this. Male circumcision only. And the women are included in the covenant through their husbands and through their fathers. So it is a patriarchal society, and that's how women are included in the covenant community. Now we'll remember in the creation story with the establishment of Sabbath that the creation story reminded the people that Sabbath was established and created by God, right? And that was the priestly author who wrote the first creation story. This is the same here. So this becomes also an origin story for an established practice. In this case, a practice established by God of circumcision. So it's saying this was not a human idea, this ritual that we do. This was God's idea. This was something established by God, just like Sabbath was in the creation story. An established practice that the readers would know, but this is the divine origin of that. I want to talk a little bit about Abraham and Sarah's relationship. There are some strange moments in the marriage relationship that I think we should touch on briefly. So first is the Egypt period of their relationship. So you might remember that they're coming into Egypt, there's a famine, and Abram says, hey, why don't you just tell everybody you're my sister? So that's a strange part of the story. So Abram comes into Egypt with some assumptions. His first assumption is, Sarah, these people in Egypt are going to think you are hot. Right? I mean, that's the first assumption. And by the way, I think all the ladies can appreciate this. A little text study would suggest at that time, Sarah was 65. So, comes in there and they say... And then the other piece is the assumption that, if they see you and they're going to see how beautiful you are, they will kill me and they will take you. And he's probably right. At least on some pieces. I mean, first off, the Egyptians do think she's beautiful. Right, in the text? We see that. They think she's so beautiful that they commend her to the Pharaoh. Like, this guy just brought his sister. You should take her into your harem of wives. She's beautiful. And she does. Or he does. So Pharaoh takes her as a wife because he thinks she's Abram's sister, which I think in the story makes Abram not look great, right? I mean, he doesn't look terribly heroic. So he asks his wife to lie to save his life. And he makes his wife available to another man to have in a culture that didn't do dating or courtship. So it's not like Sarah could say, I don't know, I just don't think I don't think I'm your type or you're not my type. So this is not the culture. So the Pharaoh just takes her as a wife. Now we can be hard on Abraham in the story. I think that's fine. But there's two things that I think are highlighted here by the text. And one is that immigrants are powerless and are often treated with hostility. This is not the last time that we're going to see this in Genesis. We are going to see this next week when we talk about the Sodom and Gomorrah story. When people come into the community and they're foreigners, there's certain expectations that there should be hospitality, but it often does not play out that way. And instead, Abraham probably rightly assumes that I'm a foreigner coming in here in a time of famine with a beautiful wife. There is no reason why these people won't just kill me and take you. I have no rights, no power. This will happen. It also highlights in this story the power of men in a male-dominated society. A king could take any woman he wanted by just killing the husband. We see this later in the David and Bathsheba story. David wants a man's wife, sends the husband out to die, and takes the wife. So when Abraham says this going in, I don't think it's hyperbole. I think this is his true belief. This is what's going to happen to us, unless we have a better plan. When we were in India, we saw something similar. Jen and I spent 3 weeks in India, and we were in a Dalit village with folks who live outside the caste system. And folks had similar stories of folks who were powerful members of the high in the caste system who would come into a Dalit village, could say to the husband, go out, I'm having your wife. And nobody was calling the cops. That was how it worked. Power dynamics, hierarchy. If it's culturally acceptable, or at least even if it's not officially culturally acceptable, but if it is culturally acceptable, it'll happen. And I think it's the same thing that Abraham's looking at in this story, that this is a realistic thing to worry about. There's a power dynamic. It's going to come back. I think these stories, the hints of these stories are important for the people of Israel as they're reflecting on their own history and the history of the patriarchs. And to look at that and say, later on, we were foreigners, and this is how we were treated. Don't be like that when you have power. And that's going to come back throughout the Torah, that you need to care for the stranger and the foreigner. By the way, Abram will tell folks that Sarah is his sister again in chapter 20. We have that to look forward to as well. This story happens again. And the other strange story, how are we doing on time? Is it close to 7? Okay. The other strange story is the Sarah and Hagar story, the other wife. So one of the things that happens when Abram and Sarah leave Egypt, because of the plagues, they leave Egypt with a bounty. They leave Egypt with stuff. And one of those things that they leave with is a slave from Egypt named Hagar. She's part of their parting gift. Hagar then, of course, comes to play a huge role in that story. And we know this because this text is very explicit. She was Sarah's servant from Egypt. So she becomes Abram's second wife in the story. And again, this is going to look a little strange to us, right? But the truth is, polygamy is common in Genesis. And not just in Genesis, but also later in the Old Testament, if you think about someone like Solomon. Polygamy is not uncommon. There's no moral judgment around that. There's also no moral judgment in the text about Sarah having Hagar be Abram's second wife. You might have realized that. God was not angry about that. It just was what it was. It was culturally acceptable, and it was fine, and we mentioned earlier about the problem with Sarah not being able to become pregnant. So the problem is not that. It's not that Hagar gives birth. That's not a problem. It's not uncommon. It's not even that Hagar becomes one of Abram's wife. Sarah actually initiates that in the text. The problem for Sarah is that Abram does not properly organize his wives. This will also sound strange. But there is a hierarchy here. And Abram is not protecting his primary wife from harassment from his secondary wife. And that's why Sarah, his primary wife, is upset. She's upset, and that's her complaint in the text. Hagar is harassing me. And Abram's apparently not doing anything about that until it gets pretty far down the road where Sarah's ready to kick her to the curb. What I think is also interesting in this story is that God seems to respect Sarah's anger about that. As if God's like, yeah, he's not following the proper customs, so you are welcome to be angry. But also, God hears, and God appears to, and God blesses Hagar. Which again, I think is a pretty radical feature of this text. Because Hagar is a woman in a patriarchal culture. She is a servant or a slave. And she is a foreigner. And yet the God of Abraham still hears her prayer, hears her cry, and promises her a blessing on her children and on herself. And again, I think it tells us something about what God expects from the covenant community who reads this text. I want to end with one last thing that I think our story gives us. And that is, I think this story foreshadows what's ahead. I think it's a hint of what is to come in the Exodus story. There are parallels and there are similarities that give us a sneak peek of what is yet to come, and this sort of addresses the comment that came this week. We see that Abram and Sarah flee into Egypt in a time of famine. That is going to happen again at the end of Genesis, when Joseph's family also flees to Egypt. We see that God sends plagues on Pharaoh to make sure that they can get out. That's going to happen again in Exodus. We see that they leave Egypt with God's support and riches from Egypt. That is going to happen again in the Exodus story. And there's also the hint of prophecy in the first covenant in which God predicts to Abram in this story that his descendants will go and will be enslaved, but they will eventually take possession of the land. And in that sense, I think that all of the Torah, but especially in Genesis, there's always at least one eye on Exodus. It's like the heart of the stories. The Exodus story, and we've talked about that as being the moment in the beginning of that community. The beginning of that community, the event that brings the community together. And so we're going to see that throughout Genesis, but also throughout the Torah and throughout much of the Bible. There's always an eye on that moment, on God's liberating work in the Exodus. We're going to keep an eye on that. As we end tonight, I want to remind you that next week we're going to be talking about Genesis chapters 18 through 23. I encourage you to read it. It's going to be very interesting. There's some, I think, stories that you'll want to talk about next week, and that includes the Sodom and Gomorrah story and also the almost sacrifice of Isaac. Some pretty big ones next week. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I know it was a little bit different tonight with the pet blessing running into this time a little bit, but next week we'll go back to our normal schedule. Eucharist at 5, dinner starts at 5:30, Bible study at 6. Thank you very much.